Good morning. It's April 26th here in Seoul, and I'm Kim Dami. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour, starting with the latest on President Yoon Suk Yeol's state visit to Washington, D.C. The South Korean leader on Tuesday secured $1.9 billion worth of investment from 6 high-tech U.S. firms for South Korea. The deal brings the total investment pledges from the U.S. to almost $6 billion during his trip so far. Also on the second day of his state visit, President Yoon visited NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, where he voiced hope that the two allies' space cooperation will be a cornerstone for their space alliance. And U.S. President Joe Biden makes it official that he will run for re-election in 2024. He says this is not a time to be complacent. We start this morning over in Washington, D.C., where President Yoon Suk Yeol had a packed schedule on the second day of his U.S. state visit. Let's connect straight to our Yoon Jang-min in front of White House. Jang-min?
Thank you, Dami. It's 8 in the evening, April 25th, live from Washington, D.C. I'm Yoon Jang-min. It is a busy day for the South Korean president, starting his second day of the state visit at the Arlington National Cemetery before holding an ROK-U.S. business roundtable and visiting NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. For more, we connect with our presidential office correspondent Oh Soo-young, who is standing by at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So, Soo-young, President Yoon Suk Yeol attended 2 major business events there that reaped some $1.9 billion U.S. dollars of investment into South Korea.
That's right, Chong-mi. Here, right at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce behind me, President Yoon, as much as his state visit has been about procuring economic security for both South Korea and the United States, the president has been engaging in very active sales diplomacy, actually calling himself the #1 salesperson of South Korea. And while this morning he attended an investment declaration ceremony here on Tuesday morning, and there are 6 U.S. tech companies pledged a total of $1.9 billion U.S. dollars into South Korea. Now these companies are in the sectors of semiconductors, clean hydrogen and green energy, and they are going to be they're going to be building production facilities in South Korea. Now, President Yoon thanked each of the 6 CEOs, saying that the company Onsemi and Green Tweed's pledges, they will be contributing to the core of economic security for both countries by strengthening the semiconductor industry's supply chain. He added that Air Products and Plug Power's investment in clean hydrogen, as well as Pure Cycle Technology and EMP Belstar, are going to play a major role in the transition to eco-friendly energy and industrial structures. Now, material science company Corning Incorporated also made a pledge of $1.5 billion. To attract further investment, the South Korean leader pledged efforts to create the world's best investment environment by drastically improving regulations so that they meet global standards and provide clear incentives to firms that contribute to the stabilization of high-tech industries as well as supply chains. Now, the investment event was followed by a business roundtable which included corporate chiefs, including the leaders of Samsung, LG, Hyundai, Lotte and SK Hynix. From the US side were Qualcomm, Lam Research, IBM, Microsoft and Google, along with General Motors, Tesla, Boeing, Lockheed Martin and Moderna. Now, the roundtable event aimed to discuss ways to deepen cooperation between major Korean and US companies in future high-tech industries such as semiconductors, electric vehicles, batteries, artificial intelligence and biohealth. High-level trade and economic officials also attended, including South Korea's Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho and Trade Minister Lee Chang-yang, along with US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo. Including the $2.5 billion US dollar investment into Korean content by Netflix made on Monday, President Yoon, on just the second day of his trip, has so far announced a total of $5.9 billion worth of investment pledges. And there may be more to come, as President Yoon will be attending a video content leadership forum and an industrial cluster-related forum later this week. The South Korean president has said through his summit with President Biden on Wednesday that the two countries are going to strengthen cooperation in strategic areas, including semiconductors, batteries, EVs, as well as biohealth, quantum technology and space tech. Back to you, Chong-min.
All right, thank you, Soo-young. Now, before we take a look at today's headlines, let me first introduce our panelists this evening. I'm joined by Mr. Amor Madhani, White House Correspondent at the Associated Press. Amor, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So it is the first state visit by a South Korean president to the U.S. in 12 years, and it also marks 7 decades of the Seoul-Washington alliance. So what does the White House say about Mr. Yoon's trip to D.C.?
This is a big deal. This is a big deal for President Biden. It's obviously a really big deal for President Yoon. I think the timing of when this is happening, too, right? Today, President Biden just announced formally that he's going to run for reelection. South Korea is super important into this turn to the Indo-Pacific for this White House. And this is it almost feels like, in a way, Biden feels really great about Yoon, and this is his chance to show off a guy that he has a lot of respect for to the rest of Washington.
All right, I will get back to you to delve deeper into the topics in a bit. But first, let's take a look at today's headlines. Attending a business forum, President Yoon has highlighted economic synergies between Korea and the U.S. through cooperation, saying the U.S. is a powerhouse in source technology and South Korea has the world's best high-tech manufacturing capacity. Our Choi Min-jung tells us more.
South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol during Tuesday's business forum in Washington expressed hopes of creating economic synergies that will benefit both South Korea and the U.S. He said this would be possible by combining core technologies from the two countries.
이번 미국 방문을 계기로 양국이 명실상부한 첨단 기술 동맹임을 재확인하고 기업인들께서도 새롭고 혁신적인 비즈니스 기회를 창출할 수 있기를 기대합니다.
Yoon noted that South Korea and the U.S. entered into an economic alliance in 2012 after signing a bilateral FTA. And over the span of 11 years, the bilateral trade volume has grown by 90%. He underlined that the U.S. is now South Korea's second largest trading partner, while South Korea is the state's sixth largest. This highlights how the Seoul-Washington alliance has gone beyond just a security alliance and has developed into one that mutually benefits both economies. U.S. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo also acknowledged that the relationship between the two nations is very unique and has been built into a relationship of trust over the past decades. Regarding the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act, the official said that the U.S. is making a lot of effort into investing in infrastructure, nurturing talent, and conducting research and development. As the alliance has been a great success for both nations, the summit is expected to further enhance economic prosperity in both South Korea and the U.S. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
And with the South Korean president visiting the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center along with U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, the two nations are expanding their alliance into space. Our Lee Dae-yeon has more.
Space ties between South Korea and the U.S. reach a milestone. President Yoon Suk Yeol on Tuesday visited NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland with U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris. During his visit, President Yoon highlighted the importance of the joint statement of intent for cooperation on space exploration and science, which was signed by South Korea's Minister of Science and ICT Lee Jong-ho and NASA Deputy Administrator Pam Melroy on the same day.
오늘 체결하는 대한민국 과학기술정보통신부와 미국 나사 간의 공동성명서는 그간 양국의 우주 협력이 명실상부한 우주 동맹으로 한 단계 도약하는 계기가 될 것입니다.
He also said that he hoped developments in the field of space between the two countries would contribute to the world while setting up fair and rational principles in terms of utilizing outer space. Yoon also mentioned NASA's accomplishments, adding that studying space will result in solutions to current global issues such as climate change. He said that South Korea is working on establishing a National Aeronautics Administration or a Korean version of NASA in order to lead the country's space economy. He also expected more space cooperation between Korea's National Aeronautics Administration and NASA.
카사와 나사 간 공동 연구 개발 프로그램을 발굴해서 착수하고 협력 파트너로서 인력 교류, 정보, 지식 교류를 활발히 할 수 있도록 커뮤니케이션 플랫폼을 구축할 수 있기 바랍니다. 카사 설립에도 나사의 적극적인 조언과 직접적인 인력 교류가 있기를 희망합니다.
Meanwhile, in joint remarks, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris said the two countries renewed their commitment to strengthening cooperation in the next frontier of expanding the bilateral space alliance. She welcomed South Korea for joining in current space exploration mission and further cooperation in the Artemis program to return astronauts to the moon. She also described the 70-year alliance between the two countries as the linchpin of security in the Indo-Pacific. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
A major part of the state visit by President Yoon to Washington is to mark the 70th anniversary of the two countries' alliance, having formed a strong bond since the Korean War. At the Arlington National Cemetery today, President Yoon took time to make sure that those who served do not go unnoticed. Our Kim Do-yeon has this report.
As President Yoon Suk Yeol started his first full day in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday, he started by paying his respects at Arlington National Cemetery. Greeted by members of the U.S. military, President Yoon laid a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier and delivered a plaque that read, "We will never forget, forgotten no more," a reference to the Korean War being called the Forgotten War as World War II and Vietnam overshadowed the war on the Korean Peninsula in 1950. While visiting presidents have paid their respects at Arlington National Cemetery before, President Yoon's visit comes as the two countries celebrate the 70th anniversary of their alliance. Some of the 215,000 U.S. veterans buried behind me served or died during the Korean War, including 27 Medal of Honor recipients. Efforts to highlight the milestone of the alliance were made during lunch, as well as President Yoon hosted a 70th anniversary celebration lunch with around 360 people from the two countries. And while giving out the highest recognition of military merit, Yoon said the service of veterans in the Korean War was not in vain.
한국전 참전 용사들의 희생이 없었다면 오늘날 대한민국은 없었을 것입니다. 한국전쟁은 잊혀진 전쟁이 아니라 승리한 전쟁이고 기억해야 할 전쟁입니다. 여러분들이 바로 대한민국의 오늘을 있게 한 영웅이자 진정한 우리들의 친구입니다.
He also emphasized that U.S. soldiers made sacrifices for a country that they had never heard of before with only the idea of protecting freedom, adding that South Korea will now do its part.
존경하는 내외 귀빈 여러분, 이제 대한민국은 국제사회의 책임 있는 일원으로서 자유, 인권, 법치 등 보편적 가치를 공유하고 있는 국가들과 연대해서 세계 시민의 자유수호 확대와 국제사회의 평화와 번영을 위해 그 책임과 역할을 다할 것입니다.
Meanwhile, President Yoon promised that South Korea will make every effort to recover bodies from the Korean War that have yet to be returned to their families, saying the country will work until the very last is returned home. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News, Washington, D.C.
The state dinner tomorrow for the Korean and the U.S. first couples will feature something special that shows friendship of the two countries. Our Lee Soo-jin has what it is.
South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol and his wife First Lady Kim Gun-hee will sit down to a state dinner hosted by U.S. President Joe Biden at the White House on Wednesday, Washington, D.C. time. And ahead of the state dinner, a surprising number of press briefings emphasized the importance of the summit. The White House National Security Advisor began with a briefing on Monday local time.
House's second official state visit this week, marking the first state visit by an Indo-Pacific leader during the Biden-Harris administration. This visit also marks 70 years of the U.S.-ROK alliance.
The National Security Council spokesperson, John Kirby, later also held 2 official press briefings, and there is another press briefing scheduled for the day after the summit, bringing the total number of official press briefings to 4. As for the state dinner, that will pay tribute to the cultures of both countries through place settings, decorations, and even the menu.
As we welcome President Yoon and Mrs. Kim, honoring the 70 years of our alliance with symbols and moments of beauty that reflect both our countries.
The table decor will have colors that reflect the South Korean national flag, while the 6-foot-tall centerpieces of cherry trees are reminiscent of both the streets of Jeju and Washington's tidal basin in springtime. The Bidens also invited Korean-American guest chef and TV personality Edward Lee to prepare the dinner alongside the White House chefs, a measure of culinary diplomacy by the U.S. first couple. The first course will include Maryland crab cake served with a dish dressed in gochujang, a spicy sweet Korean fermented paste to honor the food of both countries. The main course of galbi, or beef short ribs, featuring butter bean grits, carrots, and pine nuts, is also a marriage of food from South Korea and the U.S. And it will be banana split for dessert, a dish that Joe Biden affectionately said was her husband's favorite during a preview of the state dinner. That will be topped with a caramel sauce infused with Korean fermented bean paste, doenjang. 이수진, Arirang News.
The White House has thanked President Yoon Suk Yeol for his leadership in improving South Korea's relations with Japan amid efforts to bolster trilateral cooperation on regional security and economic challenges. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby, speaking to South Korean reporters on Tuesday, noted that Yoon's diplomatic outreach to Japan aligns with U.S. President Joe Biden's desire to bolster trilateral ties and that the two East Asian neighbors mending fences is a good thing for the region and the world. Ahead of Yoon and Biden's Wednesday summit, Kirby said Washington is looking forward to broadening and deepening the bilateral alliance, calling South Korea a force for good in the world. Regarding discussions on Ukraine and Taiwan, the official said the U.S. won't be pushing Seoul to do more for Washington, but instead talking about how the allies can work together as guarantors of peace and security. For those who are just tuning in, you are watching Arirang's special coverage of the South Korean president's state visit to the U.S., coming to you live from Washington. And for further discussion on tomorrow's Yoon-Biden Summit, we are back with Amor.
Hi.
Hi. So the U.S. is keeping close tabs on security in Northeast Asia. North Korea is ratcheting up its arms protests, including missiles and a potential nuclear test. When Presidents Yoon and Biden met for their first summit last year, their agenda centered around bolstering the allies' extended deterrence. So what do we expect this time when it comes to the allies' joint defense posture?
So the White House is promising tomorrow you're going to hear some major announcement on nuclear deterrence. This is going to be the number one centerpiece issue of this summit. The White House is fully aware of what Yoon needs politically and how big of a deal this is at home and where the anxieties of South Koreans. But this is also something that the White House knows is important for them and the security of the Indo-Pacific. The White House feels really lucky during the first year of Biden. North Korea was quiet during COVID, during the lockdowns. They knew that this would be something that they would have to put more attention into, and it's happening now.
All right. And Washington calls the alliance, the Seoul-Washington alliance, the linchpin for the peace and security in the region. There's a war in Ukraine. The U.S. competition with China shows little signs of abating. And while Washington is bolstering its partnership with South Korea and Japan, so where do you think that leaves the allies' foreign policy?
So there's this issue that I think Biden was faced with early on, especially once the Ukraine war started. Essentially, can you walk and chew gum at the same time? Part of the second visit and why it is a Indo-Pacific nation that's just getting this second state visit, and it is a big honor, is to underscore this pivot towards Asia, that it is happening. All these presidents have said that they were going to pivot to Asia, tried, but something else got in the way. Something else did get in the way, but Biden, I think it's extremely important to this administration to follow through, and that they really feel that there's no choice but to make that pivot. And they really need to bolster some of these allies. And really, Seoul is at the top of that list.
And Seoul is more like shifting towards global pivotal state and shifting away from its strategic ambiguity with its relationship with China.
Yeah, and it's interesting also how Ukraine fits into all of this. And I think that there's going to be some of that backdrop tomorrow. I don't think you're going to see Biden, obviously calling out Yoon to provide arms to Ukraine. But there is a lot of flattery going on right now. White House folks have gone out of the way to say how impressed, one, they are with Yoon, but with the South Korea story. This is a country, right, 70 years ago, calculating GDP would have been difficult. Today, it's one of the biggest economies in the world. It's one of the most advanced. The sophistication, why the importance of chips in this moment. Basically any sort of high-tech thing you could think of, South Korea is important. But with that, I think there's going to be sort of some slight nudging of saying, you are an important power, and important powers do big and hard things.
All right, so there's some point there. You have some point there. And last year, when the two leaders met for the very first time, they met at a Samsung semiconductor factory in Korea. It's a symbol of cutting-edge technology and the economic security. So what do we expect when it comes to bilateral cooperation in the economy?
So, the semiconductor issue is huge for the U.S., and I think there's going to be subtle pressure continue to be placed on making sure that advanced materials do not get to China. They're going to try to push Yoon along much in the way that they've gotten agreements from the Dutch and the Japanese. We'll see what happens there. There's obviously stuff that South Korea cares about too, and last year it got a little bit testy or a little bit concerning about the Inflation Reduction Act. I think that's mostly a last year's story. I don't think we're going to hear anything big out of that. A lot of the investments that South Korea is doing in the U.S., including this new battery plant that Samsung and GM announced today. The factory that's going to open, the Hyundai factory in Georgia that's going to open, I believe, in 2024 or around there. A lot of the stuff is going to be getting online. So if the Inflation Reduction Act is still in place, that's a big if, because who knows what's going to happen in this upcoming election. But South Korea is going to be able to benefit from some of this, maybe not right away, but more and more as time goes on if Biden is reelected.
And you mentioned the IRA. What about the U.S. Chips and Science Act? Because some watchers in Korea say the U.S. Chips Act demands too sensitive data from chip makers for subsidies.
Yeah, I think they're very focused on getting South Korea in the same place that the Dutch and Japanese are. And the U.S. sees this as vital. They want everybody swimming and rowing in the same direction, and there's going to be a lot of talks. I think it's not going to be very public, but the private talks are going to be trying to pull Seoul a little bit closer on this trip on that.
And recently leaked U.S. military documents have sparked controversy over alleged U.S. wiretapping of its allies and partners, among which is South Korea's top office. Seoul says much of the info is fabricated, while Washington says the alliance stands strong. So will this issue be addressed at the summit tomorrow?
I'm sure it'll certainly be asked when the two presidents have their joint press conference tomorrow by either an American or South Korean reporter. But, you know, this is an issue that both sides want just to go away. South Korea knows that the U.S. makes efforts to dig in and spy on Seoul. They're not pleased, obviously, that it came out in the open. But this is something that they can get by, and this is something in both countries' interest. For it to just sort of linger away and vanish is what both presidents hope will be accomplished.
All right. Amor Madhani, White House Correspondent at the Associated Press. Many thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And Hami, this meeting could carry great significance for the two countries in terms of security, the economy, and much more. And for more of the day's headlines, back to the Arirang News studio in Seoul with our Kim Dami. Tommy, take it away.
Thanks, Jungmin. Now, on to other news. U.S. President Joe Biden has made official his re-election bid to, quote, finish this job. In a video released on Tuesday, President Biden said, "This is not a time to be complacent. That's why I'm running for re-election." The announcement comes exactly 4 years after his last campaign kicked off. Now, with the announcement, the next election will likely see a rematch between Biden and former President Donald Trump. Trump has already launched his own campaign and is leading in his party's nomination race. Biden's re-election bid comes as the 80-year-old is already the oldest serving president in the U.S. history and faces low approval ratings. To the latest on the Ukraine crisis, a Russian missile struck a museum there, killing 2 and wounding 10 others. Tuesday's incident marks yet another attack on civilians. Our Yi-seung-ja's more.
A Russian missile hit a museum in the Ukrainian city of Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region on Tuesday, killing at least 2 people and wounding 10 others. According to Ukraine's State Emergency Service, the 2 killed were women rescue workers retrieved from the rubble of the History Museum. Ukrainian authorities say Russia used its S-300 air defense missiles in the latest attack. The missiles are a type that Ukrainian air defenses are unable to intercept. In response to the deadly attack, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky called Russia a terrorist country that is doing everything to destroy Ukraine and its history, culture, and people. Moscow did not immediately comment on the latest attack, but has previously denied allegations of deliberately targeting civilians. Meanwhile, according to a report in Monday's Washington Post, citing classified U.S. intelligence documents, Ukrainian officials had made plans for mass strikes on Russian cities to mark the first anniversary of the war in February. The country's military intelligence chief had ordered the attack, but was ultimately scrapped after orders from Washington. The details in the report were part of the leaked classified intelligence information that made global headlines in recent weeks. Officials in Kyiv are disputing the Washington Post's article, stressing that the news report was based on unproven information and calling the media outlet sensationalized media. Yi-seung-jae, Arirang News.
British American Tobacco agreed on Tuesday to pay a fine of $635 million to U.S. authorities after pleading guilty to charges that it violated U.S. sanctions on North Korea. The fine marks the largest North Korean sanctions penalty issued by the U.S. Department of Justice and includes a $508 million civil settlement agreement with the U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control, which enforces U.S. sanctions. A U.S. Department of Justice official noted that the BAT and a subsidiary engaged in an elaborate scheme to sidestep the sanctions and sell tobacco products to North Korea via a third party. The sanctions breaches are related to business activities in North Korea between 2007 and 2017. On the local front, a special podium in front of Gyeongbokgung Palace here in Seoul will be restored after being ripped up and replaced with railroad tracks during the Japanese occupation of Korea. The area will be open to the public this October. Choi Soo-hyung reports.
Woldae is a wide, square-shaped traditional podium that has no roof and is usually found in front of an important building like a royal audience hall or the big gates to a palace. It means a podium to look at the moon. South Korea's Cultural Heritage Administration is currently restoring the Woldae to Gyeongbokgung Palace, with work having started in September last year. Woldae was used for royals, nobles, and high-ranking officials to stand on to participate in large royal events. The Gwanghwamun Woldae was built during the Joseon Dynasty's King Gojong era to make its dynasty even greater under Japanese occupation.
Woldae is a raised podium that serves to elevate the level of Gwanghwamun, highlighting its dignity.
The Cultural Heritage Administration began excavating the Gwanghwamun Square area last September for the first time in 57 years, carrying out restoration work by referring to photographs and materials that had been handed down since the 1890s.
We were able to confirm what had been there before, and there were no problems in restoring Woldae because there are clear photos and records that we can use as historical data.
As the work began, railroad tracks from the Japanese occupation of Korea were discovered. Woldae had been destroyed in order to build the tracks. However, the administration found stones that indicate the overall size of Woldae, which was an important clue in restoring the original shape. This makes the restoration process much smoother. The scale will be 48.7 meters from north to south and 29.7 meters from east to west. The low stairs that lead up to the podium will also be restored, and the King's Path that crosses the center of the podium from north to south will also be remade. Cultural heritage restoration experts will work together to ensure that the restoration process is more authentic and accurate. Choi Soo-hyung, Arirang News.
Good morning, I'm Matthew Ashley, and we now turn over to stories from around the world. We begin in northwest Pakistan, where at least 17 people have been killed in two blasts at a counter-terrorism office that brought down neighboring buildings. Over 50 others were injured, and most of the dead are police officers. Now, the explosions took place on Monday local time in the Swat Valley in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. The blasts are suspected to have been caused by the ignition of ammunition from an electric short circuit. However, the explosions come amid a number of attacks against Pakistani security forces over the past few months. In February, 10 police officers were killed when a suicide bomber drove a motorcycle into a police truck, while in late January, over 80 officers were killed in a suicide bombing at a mosque. Swat Valley was previously controlled by Islamist insurgents until they were forced out in 2009. Now, moving on to space news, a commercial lunar lander by Japanese startup iSpace may have failed to reach the moon. Called the Hakuto R lunar lander, the uncrewed spacecraft was said to be the first from a private company to successfully touch down on the lunar surface. But iSpace has not been able to communicate with the lander since its expected landing time, and has said it assumes that the mission failed. The lander was also carrying payloads from multiple countries, including a lunar rover from the United Arab Emirates. Measuring 2 meters in height and weighing 340 kilograms, the spacecraft spent 5 months traveling to the moon after being launched from Cape Canaveral in December. And finally, iconic musician, actor and activist Harry Belafonte has died at the age of 96. According to his publicist, Belafonte passed away on Tuesday local time from congestive heart failure. He was known as the King of Calypso following the success of his 1956 hit, The Banana Boat Song. And his acting career took off after starring in the Broadway musical Carmen Jones. Belafonte was also an outspoken activist on many fronts, befriending figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela. He supported civil rights campaigns and even led one that opposed South African apartheid. Born in 1927 in New York, Belafonte got interested in acting while working as a janitor and began singing in nightclubs. He landed his first recording contract in 1949.
Good morning. Those of us in central parts of the country need to keep a small umbrella handy with light passing rain in the forecast throughout the day. And it was a chilly Tuesday yesterday, and highs will rise today, but still hovering below norms in most parts of the country. Southern provinces will have brighter skies with normal to good air quality nationwide, and a light wind might make it feel a little chilly today, so do dress accordingly. Lots of people are coming down with colds due to the up and down temperatures. And do expect to have that trend through the end of April, but at least temperatures will return to normal tomorrow afternoon with sunnier skies in central parts of the country. Now in Washington, D.C., where the South Korea-U.S. Summit will be held, morning clouds will give way to afternoon showers with refreshing temperatures on Wednesday. With that in mind, here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That wraps up today's New Day at Arirang. Thanks for watching.